Hello everybody. Over the past week I've been playing just two decks, one for the Allies and one for the Axis, both of them suggested by Briar in the comments section of my last week in review video. Remember to post in the comments if you'd like to see any specific decks played during my week in review. So without further ado, let's jump right in. On screen right now is my first iteration of the third VDV, and it was tragic. I incorporated as many of the Desetniki DT as I could possibly cram into the deck, as these units were thoroughly enjoyable to use. They excelled at mid and long-ranged engagements thanks to their 3 DTs as weapons, and they did a decent job of making up for the fact that all of my other infantry had to be in tickling distance to hurt an enemy. The tank tab was fairly standard, T-34s here, T-34s there. I went really overboard in the AA tab for some reason, bringing in a lot more Zenarts than I needed, and most of them were coming in the Dushka transport also. The artillery tab tricked me right off the bat with this 100-point WC-52 KAO 132mm off-map truck. The first time that I brought this in, I thought it was going to be a 132mm off-map carrier such as the one found in 97th Guard, and give me an early foothold that I could clamp onto and sort of get these close-ranged infantry into range. Much to my chagrin, the first time that I moved it up, I saw that the only option available was smoke instead of real off-map, and let's just say that did not end well. I also brought in a Phase B card of the M30 122mm to use as anti-tank guns should I encounter any Panthers or King Tigers, and a Phase C card of the 203mm howitzers because these guys are just good. My air tab was similarly built around the idea that I wouldn't be able to contend open grounds if I were to encounter them, and so everything in it was filtered to kill tanks or long-ranged MG34s or the like. I would like to interject here before getting to how it looked after the week was done and say that this was probably my least favorite deck in all of Steel Division. I had absolutely zero fun playing this. Anytime that I won a game while playing this, it was completely due to my allies and had nothing to do with my ability to add anything. Hell, I wasn't even a good contender in close quarters engagements in forests against the likes of 14th Infantry or anything else that got the Big Light Series infantry. It is also worth noting that the Descent VZOD PTRS teams do not throw their HE grenade. I know that the HE grenade on these units has a listed 60-meter range, but on several occasions throughout this week I had them within that range and they refused to throw the grenade, even after I toggled off all other weapons. Couple that with the fact that the IL-2 TAC-37 that they get access to with its cannon is the worst version of that plane available, meaning that tanks were almost always a thorn in my side. They only get access to one card of the ZIS-2s, so hope you're using those properly. And they have 3 units, literally 3 cards that they can bring in with longer than a 100-meter range in the infantry tab. If you want my advice on how to use these in team games, don't. Literally do not bring this deck in if you want to have a good time in team games. I know that there's likely a way that you could do better than what I did with it. However, it wasn't enjoyable to play at any point, so I would just advise skipping it. On screen now is a picture of how my deck looked at the end of the week. As you can see here, I did really want to delete the battle group. No, but for real, I did try to make adjustments to it and did honestly try to make this deck worth playing. I settled on making it a Vanguard deck as I figured early footholds were best with the number of spammable infantry that are available in this deck. I moved a card of Desetniki to Phase A and brought in a few more earlier infantry squads than I was otherwise. The anti-tank tab got swapped around, mainly because the VZOD Descent, as I said before, were glitched out, and so I stopped bringing them in as they were more or less worthless. The Phase A got 2 cards of Kashushkas and retained the smoke off-map, even though it wasn't tremendous for me. I still found myself using it to subvert gun lines. I also picked up a card of the Valentine 9s so that I could potentially box with Panzer 4s or the like, but these oftentimes ended up disappointing me whenever they got to the front lines. I got rid of a lot of my anti-tank plane capability and ended up swapping over to the IL-2M3, which did a much better job for me in this deck. I also dropped the Ognamachiki as they were kind of a niche that was already filled by the rest of the deck, Everything in the deck excelled at 100 meters, and so another unit that did that in the very limited support tab wasn't really calling to me. Honest to God, even with all these changes and implementations, I was still finding that it was incredibly difficult to get any sort of foothold against an enemy. The AA tab having nothing but stationary AA pieces meant that if they ever fired, they would just get shelled to death, and this happened every single time regardless of how often I moved them. The artillery tab was a nice boon, with the 203mm coming in phase A in later iterations of my deck, as it was able to stop some of that battery that was harassing me and put some real punishment onto enemy infantry, but I had nothing to follow it up with. Any forest or building in the game is oftentimes more than 100 meters away from where the enemy might be, and thus my Desetniki just got mowed down in the open. As I said in the opening, the Desetniki DT did fairly well for what they were worth, and did a decent job of keeping everything apart at the range they would engage at. However, they weren't enough to keep the enemies off and have no anti-tank capability, and so they really suffered in those sort of like mid-ranged engagements because of that. I found that my strategy oftentimes was to rush a particular location, napalm bomb the road leading to that location from the enemy spawn, and try to get as many nuisances into the enemy's face as possible before they were able to properly counterattack. To be clear about something, over the last week I've played 17 games with VDV. I've won 2 of those games, and every single one of the games that I lost, I would have won if I were playing another deck. In its current state, and this is agreed throughout the entire community given any tier list I've ever looked at, VDV is in such a terrible place right now that it is literally not worth playing. So skip this deck if you're looking to find something that you're going to have fun with. Moving on to the Axis side, I have Lovas, and this deck was actually a lot of fun to play throughout the week. I only got to play it 12 times to the 17 times I was on Allies, because everybody wants their King Tigers nowadays. But I found that I was winning a lot more and had options available for any given engagement with this deck where I didn't have any options available in VDV. Throughout the week, I actually made no adjustments to this deck as I found it had an answer to everything in every phase from the first iteration I had built of it. In the Recon tab, I brought in the 2-man Recon teams just to spot for my more blind tanks in this deck, as well as a few of my infantry squads that seem to lack eyeballs. I also brought in a card of the Toldi 2As, but a case could be made to bring in more of the Toldi 2s, as well as the Toldi 1s also found in this tab. My infantry tab was pretty standard as far as Hungarian decks go. I brought in a lot of their mid-ranged options and really relied on the Hujar quite a lot. Them having 3 LMGs really sets them apart in those mid to long ranged engagements, and I found that they were excellent at dealing with any sort of infantry in a town. However, if I had to pick a standout tab, it would be the tank tab. The Tehran 1 and Tehran 2 really overperform for their 30 and 35 point respective price tags, and I found that just spamming 3 to 6 of these guys was enough to blow through any front. They would regularly engage DP units on the opposing team with PTRSs and win that engagement. What's more, they would find enemy guns or mortars in some instances and just tear them completely apart. I even found that during the week I fell back an IS-2 or 2 with these units. A case could be made to even bring in more of these and perhaps make this a Juggernaut deck with another card of Phase C Tehran 1s, just to get that extra little bit of spam at the end, though that's really not my playstyle. The support tab is also quite standard, card of the Phase A flame troops, as well as a card of the Phase A support guns, just to try and keep that long-ranged engagement alive. The anti-tank tab was also quite standard, 2 cards of Pack 40s, also the Hetzer, coming in Phase A at 1-star veterancy because I only lost 1 of them, and some of the Panzerschreck squads coming in Phase B. My anti-air tab was also quite standard, some of the Bofors, some of the Vicar looking things, as well as my absolute favorite Hungarian unit, the Nimrod. This thing is devastating to planes, infantry, tanks, whatever you aim it at, it just kills the hell out of it. If the tank tab was the standout tab for this deck, the Nimrod is still the standout unit for all of Hungary as a nation. I found that just combat marching 2 or 3 of these in a row would just oftentimes destroy entire enemy battalions, taking them apart from their tanks to their guns to their infantry and still coming out the victors. The artillery tab, as is with most of the decks that I play, was it was there. The FK M05 76.5mm I was using more as infantry support guns than I was as artillery unit, but the 149s really perform well and come in the supply trucks. The 105 also did its job in that it just helped me secure those early footholds, and the 105s in Phase A really helped me to stop enemy battering. I also brought in 2 cards of the Ju-87 DTAC-5s in Phase A, because the thing that most often stopped me in Phase A were just like these blocks of tanks or T-34s, and so bringing in both of those in Phase A allowed me to just spam out answers to those problems as fast as possible. I also find that cluster bombers get less and less useful the later in the game you bring them in, because that's when the enemy has more of an AA line set up, and those cluster bombers oftentimes just don't drop their munitions in phases B and C. I also brought in an obligatory card of the FW-190 fighter bombers and the Ju-88 ATAC-4s. These ones are not the dive bombers, and thus they are actually useful units. I had a lot of fun playing this deck, honestly. I found that it excelled at taking cities, with the exception of any time that I forgot the Lovas did not have a machine gun. They really performed well in the open, too. The Hetzer was more than enough to deal with any enemy tanks that weren't IS-2s, and if I was fighting IS-2s, things had already gone wrong in the first place. Overall, I'd say one of the strongest assets this deck has to offer is the fact that very few people actually know what any of the units do. If you see a Panzer Grenadier, you know full well what a Panzer Grenadier has and how effective it is in combat. However, I find that even after playing this deck, if I see a Kefashirak, or however it is you pronounce that, I still don't know what the hell it has or what it can do in combat. On top of that, the Tehran series is really just great at most everything except for engaging enemy tanks at longer than, say, 500 meters. And even below that range, medium tanks are still going to give this thing hell. Overall, I'd give this deck a B for difficulty to learn, because there's a lot of newer and interesting units that are available only in this deck and in the Tartalek division, so you don't see them anywhere else, and so you don't get a lot of practice with them. However, it was the most fun I've had out of the 4 decks that I've played in this series so far. If you're looking for something on the Axis side that excels at taking cities, but isn't quite the MP44 speed, give these guys a try. This is going to excel at not only taking the city, but holding it afterwards with these really niche support units such as the Nimrod or the Tehran. And it's also fantastic at supporting your allies later on with these Tehran spams that can kind of blow through enemy front lines and allow their heavier tanks to follow them up and cause the real damage. That's going to do it for this week in review for VDV and First Lovas. I know this one's going to be a little shorter than my other videos, but that's mainly because of how much I disliked VDV. In the end, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you guys next time.